The frost had come early that year, and it lay along the sills of Ellswick Hall like something that intended to stay. Smoke hung low over the chimneys, refusing to rise in the flat grey air, and underneath it the house smelled of beeswax, cold stone, and the particular sourness of a great many candles burned too fast the night before. Agnes Marsh, Duchess of Ellswick, was the kind of woman a room noticed only when it wanted someone to blame. She had been the Duchess for 2 years and 11 months, and in that time the family had not once forgotten that she had not always been. She stood now at the far end of the long gallery, in a gown too plain for the portraits around her, and she did not sit down though a chair had been left for her, pointedly, at the foot of the table. Before the candles in that room guttered low, someone was going to be asked to leave Ellswick Hall for good. Agnes had known it since the letter came summoning the family to council, and she had known too, with the flat certainty of a woman who had spent her whole life being asked to leave rooms, that it was not going to be the boy. Lady Cordelia Marsh sat at the head of the table in her brother's absence, her spine straight as a poker, her hands folded with the stillness of a woman who has rehearsed folding them. She was the Duke's only sister, and she had never once in 3 years called Agnes by her given name. "We are not a court," Lady Cordelia said to the room rather than to Agnes. "We are a family. And a family may decide, among itself, what is best for a child too young to decide for himself." Mr. Silas Marsh, a cousin twice removed with a soft chin and a harder eye, murmured his agreement into his sherry. The family solicitor, Mr. Pruitt, sat with his papers squared before him and did not look up. Mrs. Colby, the housekeeper, stood by the door with her hands folded into her apron, because someone below stairs had thought it proper that a witness of long service be present, and because Mrs. Colby had asked to be that witness herself, in a voice that did not invite refusal. "His Grace is in London," Lady Cordelia went on, "delayed by the floods on the northern road, and likely to be delayed a fortnight more. In his absence, someone must speak for the good of this house. I do not say it with pleasure. I say that a boy of 8 cannot be raised by a woman who mended linen for her bread 3 years ago, however kindly she may mean it." "She means it kindly, Mr." Silas said, "which is precisely the trouble. Kindness is not breeding." Agnes did not answer that. She had learned in 3 years that silence cost her nothing, and gave them nothing to repeat at other tables. It was the boy who spoke. He stood up from his chair at the side of the room, where children were meant to be seen for a moment and then sent to bed, and he asked, in the plain, unhurried voice of a child who has practised a sentence many times so as not to lose his nerve in the middle of it, whether he might have leave to speak. The room went the particular kind of quiet that follows a thing no one expected. "You are 8, Lady Cordelia said, not unkindly, only as one states a fact of weather. This is not a matter for children. It is a matter about me," Tom said. "I think that makes it a matter for me most of all." Mr. Pruitt's pen, which had been moving, stopped. Mrs. Colby's hands tightened once in her apron, and did not otherwise move at all. "Very well," Lady Cordelia said, with the air of a woman granting a small mercy she expects to regret. "Speak, then, and be brief." Tom looked, first, at Agnes, the way a swimmer looks once at the shore before going under. Then he looked at his aunt, and at the cousin, and at the solicitor with his squared papers, and he began. "You all say she is not fit," he said. "I want to tell you what happened 3 winters ago, when I was 5, because I do not think any of you know the whole of it. I did not know the whole of it myself until Mrs. Colby told me, and I have thought of little else since. Tom, Agnes said low, a warning and a plea in one word. I have leave to speak, the boy said, not unkindly, but with a steadiness that made his aunt's mouth go thin. Please let me finish it. No one moved to stop him. Even Lady Cordelia, whose whole life had been built on the correct management of a room, found she had nothing correct to say to a child who had asked, properly, for permission, and meant to use every word of it. And so he told them. This is the story he told, though he had been too small and too fevered at the time to have seen the whole of it himself. This is what none of them in that gallery could have known, not even the boy in the middle of it, though it began, as these things often do, with weather. 3 winters before, the frost had come down on the village of Fenley, hard and sudden, the kind of cold that turns a puddle to glass between 1 hour and the next, and it had brought with it the smell that Agnes Vane, as she was then, associated for the rest of her life with dread. Wet wool drying too near a poor fire, tallow smoke, and underneath both of them the flat mineral smell of snow that has not yet decided whether to become rain. She was 25 that winter, and she was the kind of woman a village used without quite seeing, the one sent for when a hem tore or a fever needed watching, paid in eggs as often as coin, thanked and then promptly forgotten. Her mother had been the nearest thing Fenley had to a physician, dead 2 winters by then, and had left Agnes 2 things, a box of dried herbs with their uses written in a hand only Agnes could read, and a settled private conviction that most people showed their true weight only when they believed no one worth impressing was watching them do it. The frost was going to take somebody before the week was out. Agnes had said as much to the miller's wife on the Tuesday, half a joke and half not, and she had not known, saying it, that she would be the one to prove herself right. She found the boy on the Thursday, near the old mill race where the ice had not quite closed over the running water, curled into the lee of a hedge with no coat and a fever already high enough that his teeth had stopped chattering, which she knew, from her mother's teaching, was the more dangerous sign by far. He was small, perhaps 5, in clothes too fine for the ditch he was lying in, and too thin for the cold, and when she gathered him up he did not open his eyes. She did not think about whose child he was. She did not think about payment, or about who might come looking, or about the 2 miles back to her cottage with a fevered child in her arms and her own boots letting in water at the seam. She only walked. She had told herself, lifting him, that she would have done it for anyone. She would tell herself the same thing many times in the weeks that followed, and each time it would be true, and each time it would matter to somebody listening far more than she knew. There was a man in the trees above the mill race that evening, though Agnes did not see him, and would not have known him if she had, since he wore a plain brown coat with no crest on it, and stood the way a man stands when he does not want to be found. He had been searching the lanes since noon, quietly, without the household's dogs or the household's noise, because the boy who had gone missing from Ellswick Hall's nursery was his own son, and because the nursemaid responsible had been asleep by the fire when the child wandered, and because he had not yet decided whether the fault was hers alone, or whether a father who was so rarely in the room could fairly lay it entirely at another's door. He saw a woman in a mended cloak come out of the dusk, gather up a child she did not know from a frozen ditch, and carry him without a single backward glance toward help, without calling out for reward, without so much as pausing to see whether anyone of consequence had witnessed the thing at all. He did not follow her at once. He stood a long while in the cold, watching the shape of her go, and something in him, which had been closed for a long time, opened a crack it would not fully close again. She did not know then that the boy in her arms was heir to a dukedom. She did not know that the man in the brown coat, watching from the trees, was his father and hers, though she did not yet know it, though she would spend that winter and the better part of a year not knowing it, was already lost. Agnes carried the boy the 2 miles to her cottage without once setting him down. Inside she built up what fire her wood allowed, stripped his wet clothes, and wrapped him in the one blanket that was not threadbare, the one that had been her mother's, and she began doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was to fight a fever the slow way, spoon by spoon, hour by hour. With willow bark tea and cool cloths, and a voice kept low and steady even when her hands, checking his breathing for the 3rd time in an hour, were not steady at all. She did not send for the parson. She did not send for the constable. There was no one to send, in truth, at that hour, on that road, in that cold, and she told herself this was the whole of her reasoning, and did not examine too closely the other truth underneath it, which was that she had never in her life waited for someone else's help to arrive before she gave her own. The boy did not wake until near dawn. When he did not know where he was, and he began, in the thin, cracked voice of a child 3 days from very sick, to cry for someone named Papa. And then, when that brought no one, simply to cry. "Hush now," Agnes said. "You are safe. No one is going to hurt you here. Who are you?" the boy asked. "No one important," she said, and meant it plainly, the way she meant most things. "Drink this. It tastes worse than it works, which is the way of most good medicine." He drank it. He did not know her name, and she did not ask his, not that night, because a fevered child's word for anything could not be trusted, and because it did not, in that hour, seem to matter who he was. What mattered was the spoon, and the cloth, and the fire, and the long patient business of keeping a small chest rising and falling, until the sun came up grey and merciless over the hedges, and the frost began, at last, to loosen its hold on the eaves. She did not know, wringing out the cloth for the 100th time with hands gone red and raw, that a man in a plain brown coat had spent the whole of that night sitting on an overturned bucket outside her cottage door, in the cold, unwilling to knock and unable to leave, listening to a woman he had never spoken to keep his son alive, with nothing but herbs and will. Nor did she know, when morning came at last, thin and colourless over the frozen fields, that the story of that night had already begun to matter more, to one particular listener, than any story she would ever again believe herself too small to be part of. Morning found Agnes with the boy asleep at last, properly asleep, his breathing gone slow and even, and she sat by her cold hearth with her hands wrapped in her apron, because she had, at some hour in the night, given her own gloves to pad beneath his head, and had not thought to take them back. There was a knock at the door, not long after sunrise. She opened it expecting the miller's wife, or the parson come to ask after the noise of a child crying in the night, and found instead a man she did not know, tall, plainly dressed, with the kind of face that had stopped being handsome some years before, and had settled instead into something graver and more durable. He asked in a voice pitched low, so as not to wake whoever was sleeping within, whether she had found a lost boy. "I have," Agnes said. "He is fevered, but he will keep now, I think." "Are you his people?" "I am come on his people's behalf," the man said, which was true in the particular, careful way of a man choosing his words, as one chooses stepping-stones. I am called Marsh. I have been asked to see the boy returned, and to see that whoever helped him is properly thanked." "There is no need for thanks," Agnes said. "Anyone would have done the same, finding him where he was." "Anyone did not find him," Mr. Marsh said. "You did." He held out, then, a small purse, heavier than its size suggested, and Agnes looked at it the way she might have looked at a snake sunning itself on her doorstep, with interest and no intention whatsoever of picking it up. "I don't want your money," she said. "I want the boy warm and fed until he is fit to travel, which he is not yet, and I want whoever left him out in a hedge in a frost to answer for it, which is none of my business to arrange, only my wish to see done." Something in the man's face moved, very slightly, the way ice moves once before it properly cracks. "You will let me pay for the physic, at least," he said. "The herbs, the fire you burned keeping him warm, the herbs were my mother's, and cost nothing but the gathering," Agnes said. "The fire was mine to burn as I chose. I will not be paid for choosing to be decent, sir. It is not a service. It is only what anyone owes a child freezing in a ditch, and if you feel you must pay someone, pay the person whose carelessness put him there, not the one who happened to be walking by." She said it plainly, without heat, and turned back inside to see to the boy, and did not see the look on the stranger's face as he stood a moment longer on her doorstep, with his purse still in his hand and no one left to give it to. He did not tell her, that morning, who he truly was. He told himself it was because the boy needed quiet more than a household commotion, and because a name like his, spoken suddenly in a poor woman's doorway, tended to change the way people spoke to him for good, in ways that made it very hard afterward to know what they had truly thought of him before they knew. He told himself this, and it was not entirely a lie, and it was not entirely the truth either. He sent within the hour a proper physician from the town, a Dr. Pell, with instructions that he was to say only that a grateful relation had sent him, and no more than that. He sent, within the week, a quiet word to the miller that a debt owed by Agnes Vane's late mother, one Agnes had been paying down a shilling at a time for 2 years, had been settled by an anonymous benefactor, and was to be spoken of to no one. He asked of everyone he sent the same single condition, which was that his name should not be given, and each of them, moved in their own private way by a man who wanted no credit for his own goodness, kept the condition without being made to swear to it. Agnes did not connect any of these small mercies to the plain man called Marsh, who had stood in her doorway and refused her refusal so gracefully. She thought her luck had simply, for once, turned kind, the way weather turns, without reason and without being asked. She did not know then that the boy she had nursed through a single terrible night was the whole of an ancient house's future, nor that the man who had watched her refuse a purse of coin on her own doorstep had gone back to that house and sat a long while alone in a room he rarely used, turning over, in a mind unused to being surprised, the plain fact that a woman with nothing had wanted nothing, and that this, more than any accomplishment or any beauty, was the rarest thing he had ever personally witnessed a stranger do. The boy was returned to Ellswick Hall within the week, wrapped against the cold in a coat too fine for the cottage he left, and Agnes thought that would be the whole of the story. It was not. A message came to her not 10 days later, carried by a groom who would say only that it came from the estate, offering her a position. The young lord's health had been delicate since his fever, the letter said, and his father wished for a steady, sensible woman to sit with him through the remainder of the winter, someone with a knowledge of simples and a patient hand, since the last nursemaid had proven neither steady nor sensible. The wages offered were more than Agnes had seen in a year of mending, and the letter unsigned save for a plain initial. Asked nothing of her but her competence. She went, telling herself it was only good sense, that a woman who mended other people's linen for a living did not turn down honest work, because it came from a house grander than her own doorstep. She did not examine, walking up the long drive at Ellswick Hall for the first time, with her one good bag in her hand, why her heart beat faster at the thought of seeing again the plain-coated stranger who had refused to be thanked properly, and had looked at her, in her own doorway, as though she had told him something no one had ever troubled to tell him before. She did not know then that the house she was walking toward, and the man who had sent for her, and the boy asleep in its nursery, were about to become the whole shape of the rest of her life, and that none of it would have happened at all if she had not, on one frozen evening, chosen to carry a stranger's child home, without once asking who he was. Ellswick Hall, up close, was a great deal of cold stone and not a great deal of warmth, and Agnes found within a week that the boy she had nursed, Tom, was the liveliest thing in it. He remembered her at once, the woman who had made the bad-tasting medicine and told him he was safe, and he attached himself to her with the whole uncomplicated loyalty of a child who has decided, once, that a person is good and does not see much reason to reconsider. "You're the lady from the hedge," he told her the first morning, with great satisfaction, as though he had solved a puzzle that had troubled the whole household. "I am the lady from the hedge," Agnes agreed, "though I would rather be the lady from the nursery, if it is all the same to you, since the hedge was a poor introduction, and I should like a better one. What is your name?" "Agnes Vane." "I am going to call you Vane," Tom decided, "because that is what Papa calls people he respects, only their surname, and I respect you the most out of anyone except Papa and Mrs. Colby, Mrs. Colby, the housekeeper, proved within days to be the one soul in the house who looked at Agnes with something other than suspicion or pity. She was a broad, dry, unhurried woman who ran Ellswick Hall the way some women run a small country, and she took one look at Agnes's red-chapped hands the first evening, and said, "Without preamble, you'll want gloves, girl, proper ones, not those you've been making do with. There's a basket in the still room, take a pair. His Grace does not count linens so closely as his sister thinks he does." "His Grace," Agnes repeated. "I have not yet met him." "You will," said Mrs. Colby, and something in the set of her mouth suggested she found this a very great deal funnier than she was willing to explain. Agnes did meet him, 3 days later, in the cold book-lined room that served as the estate's office, and it took her a full 10 seconds of studying the tall man behind the desk, grave and unsmiling, dressed now in a coat with the crest she had not seen on the plain brown one, to understand that Mr. Marsh, who had stood in her doorway with a purse he could not make her take, and his Grace the Duke of Ellswick, were the same unhappy secret kept in one man's face. She did not curtsy. She stood very still instead, the way a person stands when the floor has, without warning, proven less solid than expected. "You did not tell me," she said. "No," the Duke said, "I did not." "Why?" "Because I wished to know," he said, "what a woman does with a lost child when she believes there is no one of any consequence watching her do it. I could not have learned that if I had told you who I was standing in your doorway." "That was not yours to learn at my expense," Agnes said, plain and unshaking, though her hands, folded before her, were not quite steady. "You let me refuse your money without knowing whose money it was. You would have refused it either way, the Duke said. I had already begun to suspect that. I only wished to be certain. Then you have your certainty, Agnes said. I hope it was worth the deceiving. He did not answer that at once, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the fire settling in the grate, and a rook calling once flatly from the bare tree outside the window. I have not decided yet, the Duke said at last, whether it was worth it. I have decided that I owe you an honest apology for the manner of it, though not, I think, for the wishing to know. I did not do it to be tested, she said. I would have done it for anyone. I know, the Duke said. That is precisely the trouble. She did not know, leaving that room, what he meant by trouble, and would not have believed, if he had told her plainly that afternoon, how large a trouble she had already become to a man who had spent 3 years since his wife's death believing himself entirely finished with being troubled by anyone. The winter passed into a slow, wet spring, and Agnes stayed on at Ellswick Hall for the boy's sake, she told herself, and told Mrs. Colby the same thing so often that Mrs. Colby began answering her with nothing but a long, knowing silence. She saw the Duke most days across the schoolroom table where he came, more often than a busy man needed to hear his son read, across the long gallery where he walked, gravely, some evening hours, and where she had taken to walking too, at first by accident, and then less and less by accident at the same hour. He was not an easy man to talk to. He measured his words the way a careful man measures anything expensive, and he rarely smiled, and when he did it arrived like a thing startled out of hiding, gone again almost before it was seen. But he listened when Agnes spoke, in the particular way of a man unused to being told the truth and hungry for it without quite knowing he was hungry. You did not marry for love the first time, Agnes said to him once, in early spring, more bluntly than she had any right to, though he had asked her opinion, and she had never learned to soften one when asked for it. Tom does not speak of his mother the way children speak of a mother they miss. No, the Duke said. I did not. It was arranged, as such things are, and it was not unkind, only cold, and I mistook the coldness for good breeding until it was too late to mistake it for anything else. She was not cruel to me. She was cruel to those who could do nothing for her, which I did not see until I began. Too late to watch for it. That is the whole of it, I think, Agnes said. How a person treats someone who can do nothing for them. There is no truer measure I know of. No, the Duke agreed. Lo, I am beginning to think there is not. He began in those weeks a habit of small kindnesses done at a distance, kindnesses Agnes did not connect to him at all, because he asked of everyone he employed to carry them out, the same single condition he had asked of Dr. Pell, that his name never be given. A widow's roof was mended before it could fail in the next rain. A boy too poor for schooling was found a place at the village school, with his fees paid by an unnamed benefactor. A debt was forgiven here, a doctor sent there, always with the same refrain. Spoken by whichever servant carried the news, he asked that his name not be given. Agnes heard the stories second-hand, in the village, in the kitchen, and thought only that Fenley had lately had a run of good fortune, and did not think, not yet, to ask whose quiet hand kept turning up behind it. She did not know then that the same man who sat across the schoolroom table each evening, watching his son read with a gravity that made the boy try harder simply to be looked at with approval, was spending a fair portion of his considerable fortune making certain that no one in his corner of the county need freeze, or starve, or go untaught, so long as he was never once thanked for it by name. She would learn it. Not yet. Lady Cordelia Marsh had come to Ellswick Hall the previous autumn. ostensibly to help her brother manage a household that had lacked, in her words, a proper feminine hand since his wife's death, and had stayed on through the winter and into the spring with no sign of leaving. She disliked Agnes from the first week, with the swift, total certainty of a woman who has decided, before any evidence is presented, precisely what verdict she intends to reach. "You are aware," Lady Cordelia said to her, one afternoon in the rose garden, in the light, pleasant tone she used for her cruellest remarks, "that my brother is only kind to you because you were kind to his son. Gratitude and affection are not the same thing, whatever a woman in your position might wish to believe." "I am aware of the difference," Agnes said. "I have not confused them." "Have you not?" said Lady Cordelia. "You have very fine hands for a mender, I will say that. Red-knuckled, though. One always knows a woman's true trade by her hands, whatever gloves she is lent to cover them." "My hands earned every mark on them honestly," Agnes said, "which is more than I can say for every pair of hands in this garden." Lady Cordelia's laugh, when it came, was a small practised thing, 3 beats, like a bell struck to signal that a subject was closed rather than because anything amusing had occurred. "How very plain-spoken you are," she said. "It must be such a comfort, having so little to lose by speaking so." She did not know, saying it, that the Duke stood not 10 feet away in the shadow of the hedge, having come out to find his son and finding instead this, and that he had heard every word of it, and that something in him, watching Agnes take the blow without flinching and without answering in kind, hardened at last into a decision he had been circling for weeks without quite landing on it. He said nothing to his sister that afternoon. He said, instead, to Agnes, walking her back toward the house a little later, in a voice pitched carefully even, "You did not answer her as she deserved." "I have found," Agnes said, "that answering cruelty with more of the same only proves the cruel person's point. I would rather prove mine." "And what is your point?" "That fair is not the same as kind," Agnes said. "There is a difference, and I have never yet met a person who confused the two who was worth much listening to afterward." The Duke was quiet a moment, and then he said, low, "I begin to think you are the most sensible person in this house, and I include myself in the accounting." It was as near to a compliment as he had yet paid her, and Agnes, walking beside him under the bare spring trees, found she did not know what to do with the warmth it left in her chest, and so, being Agnes, she did what she always did with feelings too large to examine at once. She said nothing further about it, and let it settle where it would. The blow, when it truly fell in summer, at a dinner given for half the county, with Lady Cordelia presiding at her brother's right hand as though the position were owed her rather than lent, and Agnes seated deliberately, far enough down the table to make the point plain to every guest who cared to read it. "Tell us, Mrs. Vane," Lady Cordelia said, using, with careful precision, the name Agnes had carried before the household, not the courtesy the Duke's other guests extended her without thinking. "Is it true you were paid in eggs, in your village, for your mending? I have always wondered how one prices a hem in poultry." Laughter went round the table, the polite, deniable kind that can always be called nothing more than good humour if challenged. "It is true," Agnes said, into the quiet that followed the laughter, unbothered, or seeming so. "Eggs, and once a hen, and twice nothing at all, when the person owing me had less than I did. I did not think it beneath me then, and I do not think it beneath me now to have done work with my hands rather than none at all." "How admirably practical," Lady Cordelia said. "One does wonder, though, whether a woman raised on eggs and charity is quite equipped to raise a future duke." The table went entirely silent then, the kind of silence that has weight, and Agnes felt every eye slide toward her, the way eyes slide toward a thing about to fall. She did not cry. She had trained herself, long before that dinner, not to cry where it showed, and she did not weep now, though her hands beneath the table had gone very still in her lap, still in the particular way of hands holding themselves down by main force. "I was raised," she said, "on a mother who taught me that a person's worth is measured by how they treat someone who can do nothing for them. I have tried to raise your nephew the same way. If that unfits me for this house, my lady, then I confess I do not know what would fit me for it, nor do I any longer wish to learn." She rose from the table then, with what dignity her shaking legs allowed, and left the room before anyone could see whether her composure would hold past the door, and it very nearly did not. The Duke did not rise to follow her at once, which cost him, in the following weeks, more than his sister's cruelty had cost Agnes. Because Agnes, walking the length of the cold gallery alone that night, with her arms wrapped around herself, decided in the particular flat certainty of a woman who has been humiliated once too often in a house not her own, that she had asked for none of this, had wanted none of the notice it had brought her, and would spare herself the rest of it by leaving before it could be finished doing whatever it meant to do to her. She wrote her letter that same night, by a single candle, in a hand kept as steady as she could make it. She thanked the Duke for his kindness to her, and asked that he consider her employment ended, and said that she would return to Fenley by the week's end, and that Tom's education was too important to be disrupted by a scandal of her making, and that she released him and the household from any further obligation toward her. She did not say that her heart had, somewhere in that spring, become entirely his to keep or discard as he chose, because a letter of resignation was not the place for a truth so large, and because she still believed, folding the paper closed, that a duke's affection for a mender's daughter could only ever have been the sort of gratitude that mistakes itself briefly for something warmer. She did not know then that the letter, left on the hall table to be sent in the morning, would never be sent at all, because Mrs. Colby, finding it there before dawn, would carry it not to the post but straight to the one person in the house who most needed, urgently, to be stopped from letting it go. Mrs. Colby found Agnes packing, 2 days later, having delayed the letter's sending on her own authority, and said nothing to anyone about it, and stood in the doorway of the small room Agnes had been given, watching her fold linens with hands that trembled more than the folding required. "You mean to go then?" Mrs. Colby said. "I do," Agnes said, not looking up. "It is better for everyone. Better for Tom, who does not need his lessons interrupted by talk. Better for his Grace, who does not need his sister's tongue wagging any louder than it already does on my account. And better for you?" Agnes's hands stilled over the linen a moment. "I do not signify in the reckoning," she said. "I never did." "That," said Mrs. Colby, coming into the room and shutting the door behind her with the finality of a woman who intends to say a great deal and does not wish to be interrupted doing it, "is the single most foolish thing I have heard you say in 3 years, and I have heard you say a good many foolish things about your own worth, girl, so that is saying something. Mrs. Colby, you think his Grace is kind to you out of gratitude," Mrs. Colby said. "You think a man who has everything he could want does not fall in love with a mender's daughter for anything truer than pity dressed up as thanks. I have watched that man for 11 years, since he was a boy not much older than his own son, and I tell you plainly, I have never once seen him look at another living soul the way he looks at you, not his first wife, God rest her, not anyone." "He deceived me," Agnes said. "He let me refuse his money in my own doorway, and never told me who he was. He did, Mrs. Colby agreed. And do you know what he did after? Do you know why half of Fenley has had its debts forgiven this winter? Why the widow Harkness got a new roof she could never have paid for? Why the miller's grandson is at school for the first time in that family's history, all of it done quiet, all of it done with strict word, given that no name was to be attached? Agnes went very still. That was him, she said. That has always been him, Mrs. Colby said, since long before you ever came to this house, and more of it since. He does not do it to be thanked, girl. He does it because he cannot bear to be thanked, and I will tell you something else, since you are set on being a fool about it. He came to me the morning after your dinner and asked, straight out, whether I thought you would ever forgive him for the deceiving. I have never in 11 years seen that man ask another soul whether he had been forgiven for anything. He does not ask. He decides, and the world arranges itself around the deciding. He asked you would you forgive him, meaning he was afraid you would not, and a man who has everything does not learn to be afraid of a mender's opinion of him, unless that opinion has become the one thing left in the world he cannot bear to lose. Agnes sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, the folded linen still in her lap. Forgotten. He should have told me, she said, but there was less certainty in it now than there had been an hour before. He should have, Mrs. Colby agreed. Men who have spent their whole lives being lied to for their money learn bad habits about the truth, and it takes them time to unlearn them, same as it took you time to learn a mended hymn was worth more than a hen's worth of thanks. Go and hear him out properly before you send that letter, or don't, and spend the rest of your days wondering. But do not tell me again that you do not signify in the reckoning. I have kept that man's house for 11 years, and I promise you, you are the whole of the reckoning now. Agnes did not send the letter. She sat a long while after Mrs. Colby had gone, turning over everything she had just been told, and when at last she rose it was not to finish her packing. She found the Duke, near dusk, in the small warm room off the library that he used, when the great cold rooms of the house grew too large for whatever he was carrying that day. A room with a low fire, and 2 chairs drawn close to it, and none of the family portraits that watched every other corner of Ellswick Hall with their painted disapproval. He rose the moment she entered, and something in his face, seeing her still there and not on the road to Fenley, made him look, for one unguarded moment, entirely undefended. "I had your letter," he said. "Mrs. Colby did not send it. I am given to understand she does a great many things I do not officially know about." "I know," Agnes said. "She told me who has been paying Fenley's debts all winter." He did not deny it. He looked instead at the fire, and was quiet long enough that the only sound in the room was a log settling, and, somewhere outside, a single owl calling once across the dark garden. "I owe you the truth," he said at last, "the whole of it, not the careful half I gave you in my office in the spring. My name is not the only thing I withheld from you that morning at your door. I withheld the reason I stood there so long before I knocked. Tell me now," Agnes said. "I had been searching the lanes since noon," the Duke said, afraid, in the particular useless way a father is afraid, when he has been too often absent to know his own son's habits, that I would find him too late to matter. And then I saw a woman come out of the dusk who did not know me, did not know him, did not know that helping him would ever be repaid, or even seen, and she carried him 2 miles without once looking back to see whether anyone approved. I sat outside your door the whole of that night. I did not knock, because I told myself the boy needed quiet, and that was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I wanted to see. before I let myself be known to you as anything grand, who you were when you believed no one of any consequence was watching you be it. That is the only test I have ever trusted. A person's manners in company tell you nothing. A person's kindness to someone who can do nothing for them and will never know to thank them properly, that tells you everything. And what did you learn? Agnes asked, though her voice was not quite steady asking it. That you were exactly what you appeared to be, with no one watching, which I have since come to believe is the rarest thing in my acquaintance, the Duke said. I did not tell you who I was because I feared, once you knew, I would never again be certain whether you spoke to me as yourself or as a duchess in waiting minding her tongue. I was wrong to let the fear outlast the reason for it. I am asking your forgiveness for the manner of the deceiving, not for the wishing to know. I would do the wishing to know again. I would not again let it run so long. You let your sister call me a fool at your own table and did not answer her, she said. That, more than the deceiving, is what I have not yet forgiven. I know, he said. I have no defence for it beyond that I was too angry to trust my own tongue, not to say something I could not take back in front of my guests, and I chose silence, which was a coward's choice, and I am sorry for it. I will not make it again. If you stay, and if you will have me, you will never again have to wonder whether I mean to defend you. I will not ask you to answer that tonight. I will ask again in the spring if I must, and your no will be exactly as safe with me as your yes. And if my answer is no, then you will leave this house with every debt of gratitude I owe you paid in full, and my good opinion besides. And I will trouble you with the question no further, he said. I would rather have your no, honestly given, than a yes given, because you believed you owed me one. I have had one marriage built on an answer that was not truly free. I will not build a second the same way. Agnes sat with that a long moment, watching the fire, and found, turning it over, that she did not need until spring after all. I do not want time, she said. I have had all winter and all spring to know my own mind, whatever you believed I still needed to decide. Then tell me, the Duke said. Lo, I will stay, Agnes said, on conditions. You will never again let anyone speak against me at your table without answering them, whatever the cost to your temper. You will never again keep a thing from me that touches my own life, however carefully reasoned the keeping. And you will let me keep every part of myself I brought into this house, the mending, the herbcraft, the plain speech, none of it smoothed away to suit your sister's notion of a duchess. Agreed, the Duke said, on every count, and gladly. Then yes, Agnes said, it is the only word I need to give you. He crossed the small distance between the chairs then, and knelt before her, an act she would remember all her life as the single strangest and most moving thing she had ever seen a duke do, and took her hand in both of his and drew the glove from it, finger by finger, slowly, as though the unveiling of her bare hand were itself a kind of vow, and pressed his mouth once to her raw red knuckles, the very hands his sister had mocked at that terrible dinner. Thank you, he said, for not curtsying to me, that first day in my office, when every instinct in this house would have told you to. Thank you, Agnes said, for standing outside my door all that cold night, and never once knocking to be thanked for it. They were married before the leaves turned, quietly, in the small chapel at Ellswick, rather than in the grand one in town. Because Agnes asked for quiet, and the Duke, true to his word, gave her exactly what she asked without argument. Lady Cordelia attended in cold silence, and left within the month for a cousin's house in Bath, from which she wrote, for 2 years, letters that grew shorter and colder still, and then stopped writing at all. That is the story Tom told the assembled family in the long gallery, 3 winters later, on the evening they had gathered to vote his stepmother out of Ellswick Hall for good. And by the time he reached its end, his Aunt Cordelia's face had gone the particular grey of a woman, watching her own version of events dismantled in front of witnesses she cannot silence. "You cannot know all of this," she said. "You were 5 years old. Half of it you could not possibly remember." "I do not remember all of it," Tom said, with the plain, unbothered honesty of a child who has never learnt to lie for effect. "Mrs. Colby told me the parts I was too small to know, and Papa told me the rest, on the nights he thought I ought to understand why I love her the way I do. I have thought it worth remembering properly ever since." Mrs. Colby, by the door, said nothing at all, but her folded hands had come unfolded at some point in the telling, and she made no move to fold them again. "Whatever kindness the Duchess showed my nephew as a stranger," Lady Cordelia began, in the tone of a woman reaching for solid ground that has already given way beneath her, "does not settle the question of whether she is fit to be trusted with the whole of this estate's future in his father's absence." "I do not believe," said a voice from the doorway, level and grave and entirely unexpected, "that the question was ever yours to raise in my absence at all. Cordelia," the Duke of Ellswick stood in the doorway of the long gallery, road dust still on his coat, having ridden the last stretch of the northern road himself rather than wait for a carriage held up by the floods, because a letter from Mrs. Colby, sent the moment the family council was announced, had reached him 3 days before, and he had not slept properly since. He crossed the room to where Agnes stood, and took her hand, bare, no glove between them, in front of the whole assembled family, and did not let go of it. "I understand a vote was to be taken tonight," he said, "on whether my wife should be asked to leave this house. I have come to cast the only vote that signifies, and I have cast it 1,000 times already, in a hedgerow 3 winters ago, and I do not intend to change it now." Lady Cordelia left Ellswick Hall within the fortnight, this time for good, for a small house in Bath purchased quietly, without fuss, in her brother's name, and never spoken of again in the family's hearing. Mr. Silas Marsh discovered, shortly after, that his own modest debts had somehow been settled by an anonymous benefactor, who asked, as always, that his name not be given, and took the hint contained in the kindness, and troubled the family no further with his opinions on breeding. A year later, in the deep of another winter, Agnes sat by the fire in the small warm room off the library, her husband's hand laced through hers, bare, the both of them long past needing gloves in that particular corner of the house, and watched Tom, 9 now and taller, read aloud from a book he had chosen himself. In every hallway of Ellswick Hall that winter, by Agnes's own quiet order, a small basket of gloves hung waiting by the doors, for any servant crossing the yard in the cold, so that no one under that roof need ever again cross a frozen morning with their hands as bare and raw as hers had once been. Their fingers, hers and the Duke's, did not let go, that evening or many after it, and the fire held steady, and outside a single rook called once over the frost, and then was still. A kindness done for no one watching is the only kind that ever finds its way home.